Well, hi all. I am Michael Morella, Managing Editor of Events at US News and World Report. Thanks for being with us for today's webinar on how to borrow smart for college. We hope that by the end of the hour, whether you're a prospective college student, a current undergrad, a parent, or a professional in the higher education community, you come away with some timely insights. I do encourage you to look for more insights, data, rankings, advice-oriented content at usnews.com/education. You can also find more details about our previous webinars and upcoming events at usnews.com/events. Before we get to our panel, I do want to note that we are recording video of today's session, and we're going to be making that available afterwards. Look for a follow-up email from our team. We also do welcome your questions. So for those watching on Zoom, we ask that you please type any questions you have into the Q&A feature on your screen. Our team will review those and try to give voice to some of them during the hour. Now for the main event, I'm thrilled to introduce our panelists who are with us today. We have Jose Aguilar, Director of Financial Aid at the University of California, Riverside. Rachel Gentry, Assistant Director of Federal and State Relations at the National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators. Harrison Hockman, Chief Executive Officer of Sparrow, and Anna Schufelt, Assistant Director of Educational Programming in the Office of Student Loans and Personal Finance at Duke University. Thank you all for being with us. Now I'll turn it over to my US News colleague, US News Senior Education Editor, Lamont Jones, to lead the conversation. Lamont?
Thanks so much, Michael. And again, welcome to everyone. We're delighted to have these great panelists with us to share some great information with you, the audience. Again, paying for college, student loans are two of the biggest issues in higher education today. So we're going to dive right in and get to questions for the panelists, and we'll open up a little bit later for questions from the audience. Let's jump right in now, and let's start with each of you describing what you do and how you have seen the COVID-19 pandemic affect the student loan landscape. What do potential borrowers need to know now? Jose, let's start with you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jose Aguilar, as has been mentioned. I'm the Director of Financial Aid at UC Riverside, one of the 10 campuses of the UC system in California. As far as the challenges that our students have been facing in terms of the pandemic, as well as the student lending arena, we've seen that because of the many coronavirus packages from the Department of Education, we've been able to provide many emergency grants to our students, specifically those with needy student populations. But that hasn't really deterred or slowed down the lending as much. Our students are borrowing about the same rate as they were before, except that their costs had actually been minimized due to the fact that they're operating from home versus living in on-campus apartments or rental apartments around the school. And so that's one of the things that I can share with you, that as far as a view is that our students, because they are working and also studying from home, they have saved some money, if you will, because of the less costs that they incur due to the housing. At Riverside, we include the total cost of attendance, so we do provide financial aid packages that includes the loan and grants up to the total cost of attendance for each of our students.
Thank you, Jose. Anna, you're at Duke, a private school. Are you seeing some things that are similar or some things that are different?
Yeah, the piece that definitely sticks out in my mind that, Jose kind of touched on at the end there is, folks kind of working. I think that's become the norm of students nowadays, whether that is a part-time job or students working multiple side hustles that somehow ends up to that full-time job while being a student is very much a reality. And with COVID-19, so many of those different income streams that folks had been used to relying on were impacted heavily, whether that was businesses, not feeling safe bringing folks in, not having enough work for folks to do remotely. And so I know with a lot of the students and families families I worked with, needing to rely on loans just kind of came with that. And it certainly wasn't something a lot of folks planned on. And it definitely added to the stress and the uncertainty that was with COVID-19, and kind of seeing right now in the space of public health, maybe some of those similar uncertainties resurfacing. I would not be surprised if we heard a lot of that similar narrative this upcoming year.
Okay, and Harrison, we know at Sparrow, you all work with helping individuals and families pull together private student loan options. What are you seeing there? What have you seen since the pandemic began? Some changes, and then onto you, Rachel, with sort of a broader perspective from the National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators.
Yeah, thank you, Lamont, and very excited to be a part of this conversation. So my experience here comes both from the private student lending side, but also as a student myself. I'm a recent graduate at Stanford University, and the problem that I'm seeing throughout the pandemic is one that permeated before as well, and that's in the search process for private student loans. After a student has exhausted federal loans, grants, work study, and scholarships, there's this last gap that private student loans are expected to cover. And the problem with this search process for students is that it's incredibly tedious. In order to find the most affordable option for these loans, students, whether those are individuals, young adults, the parents, international students, they're having to shop their loans at each lender individually. And so that's an incredibly redundant process. One of the things that we've seen is all these lenders, private student lenders, ask for the same information for each of these applications. And so to give a little background as well as to where I'm coming from in the private student lending industry with Sparrow, this is one of the inefficiencies that we're trying to address that's been particularly heightened during COVID, and especially when you're trying to consider borrowing smart in a post-pandemic environment. And so, with this inefficiency in applying each private student lender at a time, what we recognized is that the same level of autonomy does not exist in the world of private student lending as it does in some corollary industry like travel. So think of Expedia, for example. A student wouldn't go, or a traveler wouldn't go to each airline individually trying to see what their price ticket is to get them from Los Angeles to JFK. They would just go to Expedia, and Expedia would do that shopping process for them. Well, the same thing doesn't exist in the world of student lending and for student loans, especially in a post-pandemic environment. And so what we do at Sparrow is we provide a marketplace where students, whether that is an undergraduate all the way through pre-professional, international students, parents, can go to shop for private student loans and student loan refinancing, where they submit a single application. And much like Expedia does to the world of travel, we do to student loans. So we will shop that loan with the 15 largest student lenders in the country, and then have those lenders compete for that borrower's business and return back to the borrower the most competitive of those offers and allow them to compare it then and there. And this inefficiency still exists in the world of borrowing smart in a post-pandemic environment, but it's one we're trying to solve. And hopefully, as we emerge from this, will reduce. And so that's one of the main drivers of friction that I've been seeing in the private student lending industry, but very excited to see what other panelists think as well.
Yes, thank you, Rachel.
Sure, thanks so much for having me today. I'm excited for this conversation. So yeah, love to introduce NASFA. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that represents roughly 28,000 financial aid administrators across the country at about 3,000 colleges and universities. So Anna and Jose are actually both NASFA members. And I think the best way to describe a NASFA member is that we're the folks who are on college campuses that are responsible for kind of running and administering all of these different financial aid programs that you as a student might be receiving. And our members are the individuals who are helping students complete a FAFSA, helping them navigate any issues they come across in that process, resolving any eligibility issues that might arise, supporting students who who might be borrowing loans to finance their education, and really kind of counseling students to make sure that you're understanding kind of what you're borrowing, what your the repayment process might look like. So really just we're the people who are in financial aid offices on your campus. We're there to answer questions and kind of assist you in navigating that process. And so at NASFA, we're here to support the financial aid community. And as part of that mission, another kind of side of our work is advocating for public policy that really promotes college access and success for all students. We obviously focus a lot on financial aid and things like the FAFSA and funding for all these great federal student aid programs. But that's a little bit about us. I think I would echo what's already been said by the other panelists around kind of where we currently are and what's happening with students on campus. We know that the pandemic has been tough on millions of Americans, including many students and their families. And students, I think Jose and Anna both did a great job of sharing kind of what the changes in expenses have looked like for students. And I think especially early on, we saw that students were facing a lot of unexpected expenses due to the transition to remote learning. And maybe that's begun to, not so much the expenses have faded out, but maybe just the kind of unexpected nature that hit us all last March. So, I think that's one thing. And I think something that we've also heard from across our community is just that aid offices are hearing from many students and families who have experienced job loss and loss of income during the pandemic. And so I think one of the biggest changes from kind of the aid community perspective is just that our folks are receiving a lot more questions from students about what are the options available to pay for college, and how is my job loss or my family member, whether that's in many cases a parent, job loss in your family, how is that going to impact my ability to pay for college and my eligibility for financial aid? So, Jose mentioned that on his campus, they receive funding from Congress to provide students with emergency grants. So I think that's been something that's really been a huge priority of financial aid offices, is distributing those funds. And then also just working to, support students who might need to request some type of adjustment in their FAFSA and their aid eligibility due to job or income loss. So I think as a whole, the financial aid community has really been working to kind of ramp up the support services that are being provided to students, and just kind of being proactively responsive to what students need. So what are the questions that we're hearing the most from students during this time? And I think in order to do that, financial aid offices have really had to be creative in kind of what they're doing to reach students, especially in this virtual environment where, many aid offices haven't seen a student in their office in over a year. And so I think there's been some really neat ways and creative solutions that folks on campuses have come up with to make sure that they're reaching students and are still able to provide that really robust support.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. Let's stay with the pandemic and related college costs and borrowing for a moment for the next question. To say that the pandemic accelerated the growth of online education is likely a big understatement. In the minds of some students, remote or distant learning and even hybrid models should cost less in tuition than in-person education. That's a perception that some have. We hear that quite a bit. Do you see that happening, Rachel? And what implications could that have for student loan borrowing?
I'm sorry, you went out for just a second for me, Lamont. Could you repeat the last part of that question?
Sure. Do you see that happening in terms of expectations some students and their families may have in terms of feeling that the cost of college tuition should be reduced if they are taking hybrid or completely online courses and not actually being able to go to campuses?
I'm actually not sure I'm really the best person to speak to that, because I think it really just depends so much on the campus. I mean, I think that's a valid question, and one that I'm sure is on the minds of many students and families. And I think it really is just going to kind of depend on the individual campus, because some schools really had an infrastructure in place to offer, robust online courses, and some really didn't at all. Maybe they weren't offering any online courses beforehand. So for a school like a school who's in that position, they're really having to pretty much build, kind of from the ground up, that infrastructure for how are students going to connect, how are we going to get faculty in touch with them, how are we going to, are we going to have to buy new software, online kind of training systems to sort of make up for some of the in-person interaction we're lacking. So I think it is a little tricky to answer when we're talking at like a high level of what tuition how tuition may differ. I do think what Jose mentioned earlier around, kind of the non-tuition costs or expense side of things, I think depending on student situation, that's probably an area where this ability to kind of work from, be in school from anywhere, we probably have seen for many students that there has been a reduction in their kind of non-tuition expenses. But I think for tuition, it kind of just depends on the specific location.
So you aren't hearing anything at your agency in terms of potential policies or anything being bandied about at an institutional level?
Yeah, I think there were some schools like early on last academic year, schools who made different decisions about what their policies were going to be on refunding students or adjusting tuition. I think we're actually kind of still seeing some of this shake out. It sounds like, a year and a half, it's been a long, it certainly has been a long year and a half, but you have to keep in mind that campuses are oftentimes making plans around tuition, what their tuition is going to be set. They're making those plans like multiple years in advance. And so I think when the pandemic hit, a lot of schools were kind of really just trying to get, taking it day by day, making those decisions that needed to be made at that exact time. And then I think we're still really seeing schools who are saying, okay, now we're going to zoom back and say, if we're going to, maybe we've built this online infrastructure, we're going to try to maintain it because it does offer a lot of great flexibility for students who maybe come from a non-traditional background, can't, want to take classes at a different time of day. I think there's a lot of really wonderful perks to online work, but schools I think might just now be having a chance to step back and say, how are we going to kind of handle this? And I'm not sure if my colleagues who are actually on campuses have experience with that, but that's kind of my take on it.
Okay, and yes, Anna and Jose, are you all getting those kinds of questions from prospective or current students?
Lamont, I think in the beginning, when we left campus, it was more of a temporary time frame, and we were expecting to come back and return to campus. And so I think as far as having those conversations, it wasn't really on top of mind as far as, how does that impact tuition? It definitely had an impact on housing. And I think at least at our university, we were able to refund housing contracts for students that were in housing, even for the first round, which was spring quarter 2020. And then any future contracts that students sign, we, honor the cancellation of those contracts without any penalties. When it comes to the tuition, I think the education, you're still paying for that education, whether it's online, remote, or, in person. What is the price range for an online education? That's something that, at least on our campus, we're a brick and mortar campus, we really don't have a strong online presence. And so if you look at other institutions, their education of tuition and fees is relatively about the same, because the instructor still needs to perform, the courses and teach the courses and have materials for those courses. Where you will see an impact, again, is what we saw in our student population. It's on the other external expenses, like housing was the major one I just explained. And although they saved on housing, I do believe that our students did struggle with finding that space, to learn, to take that course, that privacy that you have when you go into the classroom. It's just you in the classroom and the instructor, versus now a laptop or your computer, and then a couple of little ones if you're a parent student, or siblings that you have to kind of deal with too as well. So as far as those conversations, that students did bring that up to the forefront at our campus. Unfortunately, because we were not moving into or prepared to move into a remote model, the questions and the answers were pretty much that we would have to continue with the fee structure that we had in place. We did look at some of the campus-based fees that were assessed based on attendance, like the rec center or the different centers that we have available. And so we did take a look at that and see if we can look into providing a refund for those particular fees. But as far as looking out a year and a half or so, more than a year and a half, we're continuing to look, we're expected to be back in person for this fall quarter. We're in a quarter system, so it starts in September. So we're expected to be back in in-person courses. So I don't see that, at least in our institution, that we're moving into a more online base. We'll probably be using more tools online tools that we have now, just because of the experience and that we have this past year and a half. But as far as the institution moving into a remote environment, I think we're going to continue to be an in-person campus.
And I don't have too much more to add to what Jose and Rachel kind of talked about in terms of that landscape, but I certainly can touch on, while those conversations were happening and folks were asking those questions, students and families were still kind of navigating. We may have these questions, but we also have a reality to face, and how do we pay for the school year? While there were maybe some reductions in some housing costs, I know at Duke, we also had a lot of students who were very much in maybe technologically vulnerable spaces. They didn't have great internet connection. And so that brought, unique challenges as well. But certainly the question of how do I pay for school, that still just kept kind of coming to the forefront along with all these other conversations. So that was really, again, kind of the lens that I can bring.
Okay, thank you. This next question is for each of you. Most families do expect to have to borrow to help pay for their students' college education. What's the most important piece of advice you would give them before they even begin to look at loan options? Other than obviously filling out the FAFSA, but what advice from your perspective would you give them? If you want to start with that, Harrison.
Yeah, thank you. The first piece of advice that I would say, and I take this from the student's perspective, having been one recently myself, is to reach out to your financial aid officer. Oftentimes, these are the individuals that have your back. They want the best for you, and they can look out for you and have been through this before. So step one is to reach out to the FA officer and have a consultation session to feel out your particular scenario. You can do a lot of Googling and find helpful answers online, but at the end of the day, each financial aid package is personalized. And the only way in which you'll find out if your information is accurate is if you talk to the person that's likely going to be on the other end of providing that financial aid package. So I would highly suggest to reach out to your FA officer as early as possible. Obviously, aside from filling out the FAFSA to find out how much federal financial aid you can qualify for, if after that point you've exhausted scholarships, federal loans, work studies, and grants, that's when the private student lending comes into play. At Sparrow, we always recommend that students take on federal loans before looking into private student loans, and will continue to do so because of the forbearance and forgiveness policies associated with federal loans. But if you are looking for that private student loan option, this is where I have to put on, again, my student cap and say, there are various technologies and tools out there that help you find the best private student loan. And that's where Sparrow comes in. That's where my perspective comes from the world of technology. And having worked with the largest private student lenders in the nation, I would definitely consider checking out Sparrow if that does end up leading to be the case. We are looking for a private student loan, either as a parent, a graduate, an undergraduate, an international student, because what we will do as a service entirely free of charge and with no impact on your credit score is essentially find the best private student loan for you in under 3 minutes, which is pretty remarkable, and also student loan refinancing. And so that's the whole, from a very high level, I'd say that's the entire landscape. But for a more granular consideration, I'd obviously have to pass it off to the colleagues and panelists on the webinar.
Yes, Anna, thank you. Anna and Jose, when you think about the questions that your offices are getting from students and their families, you've been interested in talking about loans? Everyone's so debt conscious, or they want to talk about the free money or the money you have to pay back first. What are you seeing?
Yeah, definitely. That is what folks want to seek out first, whether that is aid coming through the Department of Education, scholarships from local community organizations, which, in all honesty, is absolutely what folks should be doing. Seek out that free money first, ask about that first, and trickle down to loans later. But kind of circling back to that framing question that you asked, Lamont, I think the very first step in all of that, before you're really talking about, okay, what aid am I eligible for? My role on campus is kind of dual, right? I speak to folks about the educational loan process in great detail, but also broader personal finances. And there is very much a connection with your academic journey and your personal finance journey. And so one of those things that I would challenge families and students is to just really think about why you're going to school. Where do you want to end up? And I know at 18, I did not have that answer. And so whether you are, again, a traditional student, a post-traditional student, you may not be able to answer that prompting question of, why am I doing this and where am I going? But you certainly want to make the decisions that you are making in school and the college you select, and again, navigating that aid process, you want it to come full circle with where you see yourself in the future, that professional trajectory. And again, just kind of connecting those two worlds of finance, your loans, but also your personal finance journey outside of school.
Again, I did a great job in kind of responding to that question as well. And what I would add, and I would even go even further, knowing that we have a wide audience here, is that specifically if you're well off, is to start looking at scholarship programs or start saving for your education. It does help in the long run, and whether it's a little bit or a lot, it would help that student, it will help your students. And so that I would even go further back to start looking into something like that to invest for that education. And you're right, at 18, 16, 17, 18, you really don't know what you want to do until you're in it. And so I think what matters most is that you do get that education, because it is invaluable. And oftentimes students are averse and families are averse to taking out borrowing or taking out loans. And one way to look at it is that you're actually investing in that degree that you're receiving that nobody can take away. As opposed to if you invest in a car, you take out a loan for a car, an automobile, and in 5 years that car depreciates. Well, it depreciates as soon as you drive off the lot. But in 5 years, you may be looking for a new car, 5 to 7 years. With your education, that's yours forever, and nobody can take that away. As far as looking at resources, Lamont, you hit it right on the nail. The first thing is to submit that FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid, even if you don't think that you qualify. Because even if you're interested in the loan programs, the federal loan programs, they will require you to complete that FAFSA information, and it will provide you with the loan amounts that the student is eligible for. At some of the campuses, for example, at UC Riverside, we do use that FAFSA information and maximize the grant scholarship offers that we have to our students, and then fill in any unmet need or any the rest with student loans, including federal student loans. There is a plus loan that's available, which is a parent plus loan that parents borrow on behalf of the student. And so that kind of fills in. That's if the parent is interested in that. If the parents don't qualify or can borrow that loan for whatever reasons, then the other resources we do, like Harrison said, offer private loan options for students that are interested in that. And Harrison made a great point as far as, they promote and they ask that you borrow through the federal loan programs first. And that is true because of the forbearances and the tools that they have and the repayment tools. But if you do find a better interest, better terms, private loans, that's actually not, it's also an option. You just have to ensure that, make sure that, the terms and conditions of the loans will fit to your financial status.
When we touched on this a little bit earlier, did you want to add to that, Rachel?
No, I don't have much to say. I was just going to also add, I would echo everything that's already been said. And I saw a question in the chat about whether you should reach out to every school you're applying to. And I did want to offer a comment on that. And I think if you're a prospective student applying to multiple schools, I think knowing that any financial aid office, as well as your high school counselor, is there as a resource for you. If you need help completing the FAFSA, you have questions about how you should answer certain questions on the FAFSA, they're there as a resource and they're able to help. But I also think it's good to at least be looking on schools' websites, because that school might have a certain deadline for institutional grants and scholarships, or maybe, and this isn't super common, but sometimes there are additional applications students have to fill out, or you have to submit your FAFSA by a certain deadline. So I think as you start the process, looking at all the schools you're applying to, taking note of, okay, this one needs it by a little bit sooner, and I actually need to send this other form to be considered for institutional grants and scholarships. And then if you have questions, you can certainly reach out and set up phone calls or meetings with each of those schools. But I think at least doing kind of a high level review of financial aid websites is really helpful. And then the last thing I would just say is, and it's already been, I think, alluded to, but looking for the same information about state deadlines. So any priority deadlines to qualify for state grants and scholarships, understanding when you might need to submit a FAFSA by to be considered for that, if there's another application, it really depends on the state. But you want to know, all of those different options that are available to you. You want to make sure that you're not missing deadlines, or you're not being considered just because you didn't send in, one extra form. So just wanted to add that.
Thank you, Rachel. Let's touch on something once again that came up a little bit earlier in terms of funds that may be available from the federal government because of the pandemic, aid that has been distributed to schools. Are there any, it can be intimidating for families and students to understand how to navigate that process, how the school should be approached, what other potential sources of aid may be out there that could reduce reliance on student loans. Could someone speak to that? Maybe let's start maybe at an institutional level, or Jose or Anne, are you aware of any resources or how students should approach schools in terms of if they've had extremely hard time, their families, because of the financial situation has changed, that sort of aid or that sort of help is needed?
That's actually a great question, and sorry for the pause there. I was trying to formulate an answer in my head. And I think one of the things that, and many schools do this, the Department of Education allows institutions to use what we call professional judgment. And what that is that in the event that the FAFSA information has changed dramatically as far as the income, the family circumstance, we are able to review current status, current data, income information, and make an assessment whether that's going to impact the student's eligibility. So I would recommend if the pandemic has had an impact financially on the family income, to reach out to the institutions that they're interested in to see about a change. What we call it in our campus is a change of income process. It does take some time to process that, so you have to be patient with us. But at the same time, if there has been a dramatic decrease in resources, we are able to evaluate that and also provide a revised financial aid award notice that will incorporate the changes that we received and verified. So that is one venue for students that fall into that category. As far as other resources, as far as the emergency student grants that we receive from the Department of Education, those are, every campus has a different process for that. And so you would have to reach out to them. At our campus, we just really targeted using FAFSA information to our low-income students, to knowing that they were probably struggling at home, not only financially, but also just finding that space or that internet connection that sometimes eludes us, even when we have a good connection. And so we targeted our funds to the low-income students based on the FAFSA information. And so some of the institutions actually may have application process for those funds. The other resource that I can also bring into the table is at our campus and many other campuses, there are some also resources, what we call for basic need resources for students. And those are additional funds that would help students that are in dire situations. So these are geared towards the very low income students on our campus. So if you're low income, there is some funding out there for you. If you're middle income, we still have the loan programs, and we still have some scholarships and grants that are available potentially to you. And scholarships, it's another tool or a form of resources that have been out there for a while. It's just the difference with the scholarship is you have to do a little bit of research on your own and apply for those resources that are available based on many different criteria that are set by the donors and the scholarship offers.
And I would love to add to that in terms of just other resources, maybe not something that folks would think of strictly when they're, again, wanting to maybe exhaust financial aid resources, but so many college campuses have, again, those broader basic need resources, clothing closets on campuses, food pantries on campuses. So even if you've exhausted everything through the financial aid office, continue to ask, do you know about other resources on campus? Do you know about resources out in the community? So many schools have fantastic relationships with nonprofit organizations in the area. And that is a lot to ask for a student who is maybe in crisis mode, really stressed out. But I certainly think that, continuing to advocate for yourself, reach out to folks on campus. Maybe if they can't help you, they might have a different network that you hadn't thought of or hadn't realized was on your campus. Especially large institutions, it can be really challenging to know all of the resources that are available to you. So definitely continue to ask. You aren't going to annoy anybody. And again, I know there's some vulnerability to that, but definitely take that to heart. Like Jose said, reach out. Even if one office can't help you, there's a very good chance another office on campus could be a great support system for you.
I would also add, I really appreciate both of your comments. And I think talking about kind of the vulnerability of having those conversations, that it's really challenging when you're already in a challenging time to kind of say, okay, now I'm going to go talk to somebody on my campus who I may have never met before. And the process Jose was talking about earlier, where requesting kind of an adjustment or a change in your financial aid because of a loss of income or job loss due to the pandemic. I think it's important. And I think as the aid community, we've really tried to acknowledge that we know that those are challenging conversations. It's uncomfortable. You're already in a tough time, and then you have to kind of do this other thing. But I wanted to add that NASA's been have done a couple of different surveys of financial aid offices about this topic specifically, and I found that the vast majority of schools have really kind of ramped up their process surrounding the professional judgment process. As Jose said, it can take a while. It really depends on the campus, but I do think that the aid community has acknowledged that because there's so many folks going through this, we really need to do our part to make sure that we are prepared to assist students and are ready to be there for students and families who are going through a really challenging time, and are going to do so in a way that really has, the student's best interest at heart and doing everything that we can for the students. So really appreciate the comments y'all both shared.
One of our guests has asked a question about whether all students can qualify for work study. And work study federal work study is a federal program, and it's need-based. And so you would work with your school. Of course, the FAFSA is related to the FAFSA. Free application for federal student aid, you have to free application for financial student aid, and you have to fill that out in order to take the first step toward possibly qualifying for work study. So it's not available to every student, and it's limited based on campus availability, funding availability. Could Jose or Anna, could one of you briefly speak to that in terms of when to inquire about work study, when to find out if you're eligible? How do you do that? How do families do that?
Yeah, you're right, Lamont. The work study allocations are very limited across campuses. Some campuses may have more than others. And so it's really based on the allocation, and it's managed at the institutional level, even though they're federal aid programs. So each institution puts a policy procedure specifically for their campus. And so I can speak to the Riverside campus that, we do have a limited amount of dollars that are allocated for our students. And so generally it's awarded to the low-income students so that they can have that additional resource. Now, it's not necessarily free money that goes to the student. It's an opportunity for students to find a job on campus or off campus, depending on what these institutions offer. And then the Department of Education pays for a portion of the student's salary, whereas and then the employer pays for the other portion. And so that's the benefit that comes to the student, because as an on-campus employer, I would want to hire more work-study students, so there's more opportunities for students. And then also the students receives that experience during their college years. And at the same time, the other benefit is that as a work-study employer, I know and understand that the student education comes first and then employment. And so I would be very flexible with my schedules with their schedules, and also, the number of hours that we think the student should be working based on what their course load is. So it's very beneficial in that aspect. I would also add that if you don't receive work study, don't get discouraged. A lot of the institutions do offer, at least we have a career services center in our campus that offers many other different job opportunities for students that are work study and non-work study requirements in place. So it's out there. It gives a good experience for students. I myself was a work study student when I was in college many years ago. And that's how I got into financial aid, and I worked in the financial aid office, and that's how I started my career in financial aid. But there's a lot of opportunities for students to look for employment on campus and off campus that provide that flexibility while you're still enrolled.
Yeah, I would just add to Jose's statement in terms of the timing of all of this, because as a student who maybe might not be on campus yet, you probably still want to start the job search now before you get to campus. That's not to say that there won't be positions opening up, but it's kind of one of those things, the early bird gets the worm. So if you're not sure where to look for on-campus or off-campus employment, certainly, try to browse, your intended or prospective college's career services site. They might be able to point you in the right direction, but that's something I tell my students all the time. If you're pretty positive you want to work while in school, which again is the norm nowadays, look early. If you haven't looked yet, now is a great opportunity, and find a fantastic employment position like Jose did. You never know, it might become your lifelong passion.
Right. Now, someone is asking about typical interest rates for private loans compared to the federal student loans. If you could speak to that, Harrison. It can be a little complex, but if you can give us your expertise on that and how one can best understand the differences between variable and fixed rates. It can really be a little too much for the average layperson to understand when they're trying to get in college or get their student in college and get it paid for. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, definitely. And as a recent student myself, having seen the loan amortization math, I can attest to it being remarkably overwhelming. So what do private student loan interest rates look like right now? It ranges. It really does depend. And why I can't say with a concrete answer is because it's entirely dependent upon the individual's FICO score of who the person applying, of what their actual FICO score is. And to make matters a little bit more complicated, there are multiple versions of FICO score, and different lenders use different versions of FICO score. So as a general rate range, for a variable rate, typically you can expect anywhere between, again, don't quote me on this, but this is just what I've seen for this month, is between 3.5% up to around 13.5%. And the same thing applies for fixed, with probably about a percentage shift. So 4.5% up to about 13.5%, 14%. Now those are just ranges. The actual rate at which you qualify will be entirely dependent upon your credit history to check for your eligibility, and then also your FICO score to see how good of a credit profile you have when borrowing from a lender. Those are my 2 cents on the landscape as to what it looks like right now. For more information about how that's actually determined and how you can how you can expect what your interest rate will be when you're going out searching for these loan options, I'd encourage you to come check out Sparrow. Sparrow, this is what we do. It's the pricing transparency tool, and it's incredibly effective in comparing all of these options so that instead of having to just hear 3.5% all the way up to 14%, you can get your actual rate. Now, as to double click on the difference between a fixed and a variable rate and which is preferable, to be honest, this is an incredibly complex question. Typically, most variable rates will start lower than fixed rates. It's not a guarantee, but that's more often than not the case. However, variable rates, by the nature of them being variable, will fluctuate and oscillate over time. And that's entirely dependent upon something beyond the borrower's control. And so if you can stomach that, you're essentially taking the risk that the rate will remain lower than what you could have had fixed. You should you could, I won't say should, but you could go with a variable rate. And if you're looking to lock something in, alternatively, you could choose a fixed rate. As for how that math looks over time, it's impossible to tell ahead of time. You don't know where the rate's going to go. And so you can't forecast it out into the future because the outcome's uncertain. I hope I answered your question, Lamont, but if there are any additional clarifications needed, please feel free to ask.
I think that was very helpful. In fact, some of the, we don't want to call it guesswork, but with the federal student loans, for example, which families may first be exposed to by filling out the FAFSA, those federally backed loans, the interest rates on those, and I want to ask particularly Anna and Jose, do families understand that each school year loan is taken out, it's a separate loan, and the interest rate may change from a student's freshman to senior year, even though it's not technically a variable loan? How are they, do they have questions around that you address on the regular basis?
I can start. Actually, I was going to jump into just and respond to Harrison and say, that's probably one of the reasons why you want to also take a look at the federal loan program first, because for the student loan piece, at least, there is no credit check or they don't check their, most students at 18, 17 don't have a credit history anyway. So, but they do have annual loan maximums. And so that's the other piece to also weigh out to see if you need additional resources, then a private loan may be a good option too. But as far as the interest rates, you're right. The Department of Education sets those rates on an annual basis, and that's for any new loans effective. Usually July 1st is when it takes effect. And so any loans that are dispersed on or after July 1st will carry the annual, and it is a fixed rate, but it's fixed for that loan only. And so the next year, a student may borrow a second loan that may have a different interest rate, either up or down, depending on the rate that is set by the Department of Education. And then you come to wonder, after you graduate and ready to pay those loans, what do you do? There are some options to kind of consolidate those loans into one if there's an option to lower the interest rate, or you can keep them separate as they are and pay off the highest, those with the highest rates if you like that kind of financial move. So there's many different options for students, but I think that answers the question as far as the fixed rate for federal student loans. And like I said, it is fixed, but for the duration of that loan. Comes again next year when you reapply, then a new rate will be in place.
There is a question that another of our guests has asked. I'd like to ask it to Rachel first, and anyone else can chime in. The question is, are there any thoughts on how the move toward test optional admissions might affect access to merit money, which of course could reduce the reliance on student loans? Could you take that first, Rachel, from a sort of a policy perspective?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that. I think I can try to read the tea leaves a little bit, but I really think that we're going to have to see, because, I think it's probably no surprise to you all, and probably the person who asked this question knows that when, particularly for larger merit-based programs, not maybe like a one-off scholarship where you're writing essays and doing lots of other, you're not just being evaluated on your test scores and GPA, but for a lot of the larger grant or scholarship programs that are based on merit, standardized test scores and GPA are oftentimes kind of the two metrics that are used to evaluate students. And so I do think it'll be interesting as I think particularly in states, I know some states have kind of at the university system level have put in either short, for the most part, I think right now they're kind of 1 or 2 year test optional policies. And I think it'll be interesting to see in some of those states that we're seeing more schools going to a test optional model, if we start to see some of those state grant programs maybe change what their criteria are. And even at the institutional level, obviously if a school's gone test optional, they're probably going to be taking a look at some of their existing scholarship and grant programs and saying, all right, well, it probably doesn't make sense, at least for this year, to have, require an SAT or if we're going to have a lot of students who aren't going to be providing us with those test scores. So I think, I do think that if we continue to see a shift in the landscape kind of on the admission side, where we see more and more schools offering this option either in the short term, but I think especially if we see it more long term, I do think I would speculate that we'll start to see some changes on, related to the merit-based aid programs as well, because they're kind of oftentimes relying on those exact same metrics.
Yeah, I would love to add to that too. And I think Rachel's intuition is kind of even playing out outside of just merit scholarships, but even how different universities and programs value GPAs. I think more and more folks also want to know, yeah, what you're doing in the classroom is great, but what are you also doing out on campus outside of that classroom? What are you doing in the community? So as some of those merit scholarship requirements, eligibility pieces, evolve, I would not be surprised if we sort of saw those curricular experiences, your leadership experiences, maybe even start to be more of the conversation versus how well are you at taking tests and what have you been doing in the classroom, as sort of maybe previously has been the focal point, but again, kind of evolve and include other pieces too in terms of your student experience and just your experience as a human.
Yeah, I think we kind of sort of experienced that too as well, even this year. And one of the ways that we tackle some of our merit scholarship is just using the university's academic index score. So usually the university would have an academic index score, or they would do a holistic review on admissions. And so we use admissions information and data to then provide merit scholarships. We actually were in a position, we moved in that direction a few years ago before the test, standards test became optional. And so it put us in a position to continue offering our merit scholarships based on that academic index score, and also any, as Anna rightly so alluded to, the extracurricular activities.
Someone has asked, thank you all. Someone has asked a question about international students and what borrowing options there may be for them. Of course, we know there are restrictions on federal student loans. And if someone could address that for international students, what options they might have? Are there private options? Are there other loan options if they need that in this country, in the US? Also for undocumented students, if someone would like to address, is there anything on the table for them in terms of loans?
I can take a stab from the private student loan side, for which I'm a little bit more familiar. So for international students, there's two options for private student loans. The first is you find an American-based cosigner. A lot of private student lenders will lend to you if you can find someone to guarantee your loan that is a US citizen or permanent resident. There are particular lenders, however, that will actually lend to international students studying in the United States without a US-based cosigner. That check will not be based on credit. It's based on some black box that they keep hidden from borrowers, but there are options for international students. And I'll also add a caveat with, this isn't just international undergraduate students. These lenders will provide options and resources for undergraduates, graduates, whether that means medical, JD, an MBA, and also pre-professionals as well.
Yeah, and that's the direction I would point students to, is that since they don't qualify, specifically international students wouldn't qualify for federal student loans, we would send them over to see if there are any private loans that they're eligible for. As far as undocumented students, that's actually a good question, and there are very few loans, private loans options for undocumented students, with probably some of the same requirements, where there's a cosigner that is a U.S. citizen or permanent resident. In California, we do have what we call the California Dream Loan. It's a maximum $4,000 per year, but that is also available for students at each UC or Cal State system through the state program.
I'd also add, and I feel a bit like a broken record because I think I've said this several times today, but I would add that it really varies based on your state. And there are some states that do extend eligibility for state grant programs. to undocumented and DACA students. So I think that's something also to take a close look at the state level to see if you might have any eligibility for those state grant programs. And this is certainly an issue that I think has continued to kind of build momentum here in DC, where we've seen President Biden pushing to extend Pell Grant eligibility to DACA recipients. And that's something that NASFA and the aid community has really strongly advocated for. So just wanted to flag that that's definitely kind of a topic that's being debated by policymakers, and we're hopeful that we'll, with increased advocacy, might see some changes in the coming years. But I think looking at those state programs is another great place for now, in addition to everything Jose said.
Another guest would like to know, sorry, a little technical difficulty here. Another guest would like to know, what are some online resources you recommend for those looking to compare student loans, compare student loan rates? When you get those questions on campuses or with Sparrow, or what are some of the resources you point them to that are extremely helpful? Anybody can take that.
Yeah, I think on our campus, specifically for private loans, we do have we have a website on our campus for student loans, and that includes private loans. And then it steers them over to what they call a preferred lender list. So a list of lenders that have embedded at UC Riverside, that have embedded by the UC system. And so we then, offer those options for students, and then additional information about the private loan process and how to do the research on that. So that's one way that we do it, and it's basically just information on our website about the private loans that are out there. Because there's, as Harrison can attest, there are many options out there for students.
And just to back up what Jose said, this exact problem is what Sparrow is in existence to solve. The actual website is just Sparrow, spelled like the bird, followed by fi.com. And what we do and how we help borrowers, whether that is a parent of a student or a student themselves, all the way from undergraduate through pre-professional, is take that preferred lenders list and then submit a single application. And with those lenders, we will return back personalized offers versus seeing a rate range, where you can compare each lender and you'll see a rate range, and then you'll have to apply at each lender individually. And so that application process, that individual application process, will just automate with a single application, which for students that we've worked with in the past, and financial aid officers as well, has been enormously valuable, saving them both time and money. So I would offer Sparrow as a resource, as well as some supplementary material that we have consistently coming out, published by experts in the space, as well as current students and their experience going through this process, actively trying to find the smartest financial aid options available to pay for college.
The one thing I would love to just add, as folks are looking for resources, the internet is a beautiful tool. You will find so many different financial blogs and things of that nature. The one thing that we always remind students, though, just read those disclaimers and remember that as you are looking at information about loans and lenders, sometimes some of those sites are paid to include them. That doesn't mean that it's not a fantastic loan option, but make sure you do have that good critical thinking hat on as you are looking at different loans, and maybe resort to more than one website before just saying, oh, this loan sounds great, I'm going to go with this. Or again, this scholarship sounds great, I'm going to go with this. Do that homework and just make sure you have that due diligence. So again, you aren't finding something where maybe there was a more competitive program out there, whether it's a loan, grant, scholarship, what have you.
And just to add a little bit to what Anna said too, I like her approach as well, but also be mindful. I mean, do the research, do the math. If you don't need the loan, don't take the loan. Do that analysis before you even put in and borrow the loan, because sometimes you may not need that loan, and you can cover it with many other different resources available. One of the things that we tell our students, specifically at orientation, is that when they see that, sticker price chalk and they get chalked on that, it's, they have to understand what is that cost includes. If it's just tuition, then do the math. That does it include housing? Does it include books? On our campus, as I say, we use the total cost of attendance, we include the tuition fees, housing, room and board, books and supplies, personal expenses, and even transportation expenses that you're going to incur as you go to the university or go to school. And so some of those costs you may be able to pay on your own just because that you've been paying it all along, or your parents may think about paying that, those personal expenses, the transportational expenses. So don't borrow against that if you really don't need it.
There's a final question I would like to ask, and it's for anyone who'd like to answer it. What advice would you give, whether it's private or federal, any kind of student loans, what advice would you give to a student who plans to take out loans with the hope or expectation that eventually they will be canceled and they won't have to pay them back? And that's sort of in the ether now. So let me see if I can draft someone. Nobody wants to touch that one. Are you all hearing that on the campuses? And honestly, or do you get the inkling that people are thinking that, especially going forward in this season, this fall? How would you maybe a student was thinking that?
So basically, what I tell students is that specifically with the federal student loans, you're taking those to the grave. So that's actually, it's not going to go away. I borrowed when I was in college, and I thank God I was able to pay all my loans off a few years ago. But they will stick with you. They will stay with you, even if you claim bankruptcy. It doesn't go away. It is a federal student loan that you borrow. So although it comes with many benefits, it also stays with you for the rest of your life. So that's one way, as far as my answer to students in that manner. As far as private loans, I'm not too familiar with this side of the house, and I don't know if they are able to get rid of those loans with bankruptcy or whatnot. But I know that for federal student loans, they will still stay with you.
And there are, families should be aware, there are forgiveness and partial forgiveness programs. For example, if you go to work in a certain industry or a certain field in a certain area for a certain amount of time, so they should be sure to explore those sorts of options. Are those things that you make students aware of, particularly Anna or Jose, when they're entering the school and looking at financial packages and the long-term debt?
Yeah, that's definitely something we try to point out to our students, especially our grad students, because they definitely have more of that targeted process of, okay, I'm in grad school for a very specific program because I have a pretty good idea of what I want to pursue for my career. It's certainly something that comes up with undergrads. I will say for the current public service loan forgiveness through the Department of Education, maybe a little challenging for some undergrad students to qualify for, just because there's kind of this perfect storm involved of how much you need to borrow to have that forgiveness actually achievable. The one thing to kind of circle back to the big cancellation question, certainly I think it's a valid conversation. I think folks on either side of the spectrum bring up great points when talking about student debt and what needs to happen moving forward. In that meantime, while those conversations are going on, similar to what I said earlier, you have this obligation ahead of you. So what I tell students, prepare for sort of that expectation that they're not going to get canceled. If you're paying on your loans and they do, that's fantastic. But if you're paying on your loans and they don't, you have mitigated some other really big financial disasters potentially, because you were really crossing your fingers that cancellation was going to happen. There's just some other risks. Our finances are not in silos. One decision in one area impacts your life financially in others, and it just may not be the risk that you want to take banking on cancellation happening in some form. So again, you're better off being prepared, and if cancellation comes to any kind of a head, you'll have a pleasant surprise, but you also won't have put yourself in a vulnerable spot.
I think to add to that too, the federal student loans do have some good benefits too, and the loan servicers are willing to work and work with the borrowers too as well. One of the things is that if you do receive a subsidized student loan, your interest and your payments don't start until 6 months after you cease to be attending half-time status. So if you graduate, you have 6 months of a grace period to make full payment on that loan with no interest, or to start preparing to start making monthly payments for that. If you do have the unsubsidized or the Parent Plus loan, the interest and the payments do start right away after disbursement, but you do have the opportunity to defer the loan and the interest but just know that the interest will accumulate while you're enrolled in school. And so there's different options. Like I said, even if you can't make a payment once you're in repayment status, the servicers are willing to work with you to either find a minimum payment that you can make so that you don't default in the loan. Because as Anna said, it's not going to go away, it's going to continue. And it is a debt that you would have to repay back.
We want to thank you so much, panelists, for your time and for your expertise. And we want to thank the audience for joining us. We hope it's been very informative and very helpful. And on behalf of U.S. News and World Report, all of you have a good afternoon. Thank you.